Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 5, where we are examining the Gospel of Matthew. And I don't know if we'll get done with Matthew in this particular lecture. If not, we'll be very close. But anyway, we left off with the condemnation of the scribes and the Pharisees, plus some additional meanings. And I mentioned how Jesus, he condemns in Matthew's Gospel the scribes and the Pharisees. He states how, they're in positions of power but not to act like them because they're hypocritical. They don't practice what they preach. And the other portion, I mentioned how it's hyperbole rhetoric, particularly with the terms master, father, and teacher. They're not meant to be taken. You can never say them. You can never say someone is master or Mr. So and so, or you know someone is your teacher or instructor, or my parent is my father or dad, whatever. That's not the understanding. They're exaggerations to make a point, but basically to say that God is the ultimate of those and you are to be humble. Don't be self-centered. And he's essentially stating how the scribes and the Pharisees, that's a message they seem to have forgotten. But there are some potential additional messages here, maybe. And that is, could Matthew have been taking liberties with Jesus in this particular passage due to the early church structure slash hierarchy, which he would have been aware of? The condemnations in Matthew are found specifically in his gospel. But the notion of him taking liberties here is that Matthew is essentially putting words into Jesus's mouth, which was a common thing that did happen in the ancient world and still even happens today in contemporary times, due to the early church structure hierarchy, which he would have been aware of. Basically, the ordained clergy slash priesthood. And it's interesting that, he mentions, three particular, terms there in Matthew 23, 8 through 12, where he mentions, rabbi, father, and teacher, because among the, early church structure hierarchy, the offices of the ordained, clergy slash priesthood, you have the bishop, then you have the presbyter slash priest, and then you have the deacon, and that maybe his reference is really, talking about them, not something from Jesus's time, but actually talking about them and essentially trying to inform them, be humble, because there's the statement, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and they were in a position of power and to, be humble. And then also, is perhaps what's in Matthew, the author taking liberties with Jesus due to a dislike he would have felt over the scribes and Pharisees? I mentioned in the previous video that, the Pharisees of the religious slash political parties, they were the one to survive the Roman Jewish War, and all modern day Jews would descend from them. And of course, the scribes were, well educated Jews that knew their faith. Um, and they would have been certainly the individuals that would have been arguing against Jesus fulfilling the messianic prophecies. So, are perhaps the words that are in Matthew 23 not actually the words of Jesus, but words that Matthew wanted Jesus to say due to the situation in his own time period? Moving forward here into the Passion narrative with Judas Iscariot. The chief priests, they offer Judas Iscariot, a member of Jesus's inner circle, 30 pieces of silver to betray him. Judas kisses Jesus to identify him there in the Passion narrative in the Garden of Gethsemane. Let me have a quick sip of water here. So in this passion narrative, Jesus, or excuse me, Judas identifies Jesus by giving him a kiss. And what's often said that you'll find in movies, about Jesus or in plays about Jesus when this takes place, Jesus often responds back with Judas, you betray the Son of Man or betray your master with a kiss. Well, that particular rhetoric is found in the Gospel of Luke. You don't find that in Matthew, but in Matthew, Judas does give Jesus a kiss to identify him to members of the chief priests, their soldiers, you could say, their officers. While feeling regret for his actions, Judas returns the money to the temple priests, but he receives no sympathy from them, and in despair, he hangs himself. So, after Jesus is captured and he has his trial before the Sanhedrin, Judas feels sympathy, he feels regret for his actions, and he goes to the temple and to the priest in the temple and says how I betrayed innocent blood, and he gives back his money, and the temple priests are like, that's no concern of ours. So in a feeling of despair, getting no sympathy, whatever, he goes out and he hangs himself. And that would certainly be, a strong reference to, a Jewish audience of Matthew's gospel, because referencing Deuteronomy, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. So Judas would be an individual that would be cursed there in Deuteronomy, part of the Torah, the law. But continuing forward here, anti-Judaism, a question mark, and you have, of course, the prisoner exchange between Jesus and Barabbas. Then you see Pontius Pilate washing his hands, and then below you have an image of the triumphant church and the blind synagogue. In Matthew's account of the prisoner exchange, the crowd in Jerusalem, they choose Jesus Barabbas over Jesus of Nazareth. Some manuscripts of Matthew's gospel refer to Barabbas' first name as Jesus. There are other manuscripts that omit his first name, and he's just referred to as Barabbas. Jesus was a common, Hebrew Jewish name. So Barabbas's first name could have been Jesus. Lots of people were named Jesus. In fact, within the Deutecanonicals, that's part of the Septuagint, part of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians, of course, would call the Old Testament. There's the book of Sirach, and Sirach's first name is Jesus, Jesus bar Sirach, Jesus son of Sirach. But Barabbas having the name Jesus and then the name Barabbas, his name would literally mean Jesus, son of the Father. And perhaps this is an underlying message about how, the crowd in Jerusalem, in this case, we're referring to the Jewish people, and this tags into anti Judaism, and I'll touch on that more. They choose a man named Jesus, son of the Father, over the actual son of the Father, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus, he's condemned to die by Pontius Pilate, but Pilate washes his hands. Pilate essentially says in the Gospel of Matthew that I'm innocent of this just man's blood, that this man is not does not need to be executed. But you chose Barabbas over him. And in response, the crowd makes the statement, let his blood be upon us and upon our children. I want to read something related to this. This comes from a book. Um, my mom got it at a flea market, but it was a textbook that was used in Catholic schools, I believe this would have been grade school level. Um, the copyright date, as I was looking, was 1936. So, as I'm recording this nearly 100 years ago, approaching 90 years about, but there's a portion in here, church history, and this particular portion is talking about the Roman Jewish War, and particularly the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And I want to read from this portion here. Soon famine, then pestilence set in. The city was torn by factions from within, while the Romans battered down the walls from without. Neither young nor old were spared. Jerusalem was doomed. The prophecy of Christ was about to be fulfilled. Forewarned, the Christians had fled. Within 1 year, more than 1 million Jews died from pestilence or were killed by the Romans. The city was taken, the temple burned, the people sold into slavery, and thus dispersed over the world as we now find them, without country or king. Truly, the blood of Christ is upon them. And that statement, truly, the blood of Christ is upon them, was a reference to the crowd there in Jerusalem in the Gospel of Matthew, which is found only in Matthew. Now, I mentioned at the start of this lecture how Matthew has a lot of pro Jewish elements. So, what about this anti Judaism here? Well, there does seem to be that. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that by this point, Christianity and Judaism had gone their separate ways. Christianity comes out of Judaism, yes, but it's now a totally different religion. Totally different religion. And Matthew is upset that there are people still practicing what we call Judaism, that they should be Christian. So, I mean, I think you could say, if you wanted to, Matthew's gospel isn't necessarily anti Jewish, but it is perhaps anti Judaism. But even with me saying that, that's like saying, to somebody, I'm not anti Catholic, but I'm anti Catholicism. Well, if someone is a practicing Catholic and you say you're anti Catholicism, that means you're against them because they practice something that you find offensive, you could say. Now, I will mention, and it's been clarified, you know, especially I think on the Catholic side since Vatican II, back in the early to mid 1960s, but even before this, I think even after, the Holocaust, by, various Christian churches, is that, if you want to go with any condemnation in Matthew, it would be the people directly in the crowd. And some of whom were yelling probably weren't Jewish at all. But, the people that would be condemned would be those directly in that crowd, not the entire Jewish world, who in many respects had nothing whatsoever to do with this. I mean, a Jewish person living in Athens wasn't there shouting, "Give us Barabbas," or in Corinth, or in Alexandria, or in Rome, etc., etc. Well, we do have one more portion to look at with the Gospel of Matthew, so we will get to that next time.